The Coast Guard thought they were towing away an old man's broken boat, but what they didn't know, what none of us knew, was who the man really was. An hour later, 6 Navy ships arrive, ... No calls, no trumpets, ... Just silence, ... and presence. This isn't just a story about a boat. It's about dignity stripped, then restored, ... How the ocean never forgets one of its own, and how one quiet man reminded the town ... what honor really means. So what happened to Frank Mallory? Why did the Navy show up in full force? And how did a boat named Grace, handcrafted, weathered, love, become a symbol of something far greater than wood and sail? Stay with us. What you are about to hear may change the way you look at silence, service, and the sea. 1. Grace. More than a boat. Windmere Cove has never been a place that makes headlines. There are no fancy hotels, no boardwalks, just a quiet marina where the sea whispers instead of roars. But if you stand by the dock in the early morning, when the ropes are still damp with dew and the water still quiet, you'll always see him. Frank Mallory. He's walked the same route every morning for nearly 4 decades. Hands in pockets, a measured pace, a nod to joggers, a gentle morning with the teenagers working at the bait shop. He doesn't say much, but somehow you always know when he's not there. His presence is like the tide, subtle, reliable, always coming back. And at Pier 27, the boat named Grace is docked, a small wooden boat worn with age, its brass railings gleaming in the morning sun. To an outsider, it looked too old, too plain, too slow, but to Frank she was anything but ordinary. He'd started building Grace after he retired from the Navy, not because he needed a hobby, but because he needed to survive. 2 years ago his wife had died, and grief, as usual, had cut deep into him. Some people drank, some people closed off. Frank took up the hammer. He didn't need Grace to be fast. He needed her to be steady. Each plank was not just nailed down, but held together with memories. The left railing, that's where he and his wife used to sit fishing on calm days. The short canopy, added after his nephew got sunburn one summer. Grace was more than a boat. She is a timeline, a silent map of love, loss, and resilience. Her decks are worn smooth by years of silent contemplation. Her rudder, turned by hands that have faced storms, now finds peace in calm waters, and every brass screw, every knotted rope, holds a piece of Frank's healing. Grace is more than a boat. She is a lifeline. Bit by bit, she has lifted a broken heart. 2. The day the ocean went still. That morning felt like any other. The gulls circled lazily overhead. The water stretched out flat and still, as if holding its breath. Frank had woken up early, as always. He packed a small thermos of coffee, checked his notebook twice, and made his way to the dock. Grace had a checkup sail scheduled. Nothing major, just a slow trip beyond the harbor to test the lines and clear her lungs before the youth seamanship program starts next week. Frank loved teaching. Every summer, kids from around town will gather to learn how to tie proper knots, read weather signs, and above all else respect the sea. That was what he offered them. Respect, not through lectures, but through presence, through patience. Jacob, his grandson, had helped him prepare the crates the night before. Salt tablets, extra rope, 2 sets of gloves. Everything was ready. The day, the boat, the moment, it all felt like habit, a sacred one. But as Frank untied the dock lines, something unfamiliar arrived. A government vehicle, Pulling up beside the marina gate, out stepped a young Coast Guard officer, crisp uniform, clipboard in hand. He asked politely for registration. Frank nodded, opened the compartment near the helm, and handed him a weathered folder, the kind of folder that had been checked a dozen times over the years. Every page was neat, stamped, up to date. The officer frowned. There have been new compliance updates, he said. Digital checks, revised safety codes. Frank calmly explained that Grace had been grandfathered under the old regulations. She had passed inspection just 3 months earlier, but the officer wasn't listening. A second patrol boat arrived, bringing to more men. No words of comfort, no attempt to explain. They boarded Grace with practiced speed, opening compartments, checking gauges, lifting floorboards like they looked were for contraband instead of craftsmanship. Frank didn't protest. He stood aside, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His eyes followed every movement, not with anger, but with something older, deeper, disbelief. Then came the sentence, the one that landed harder than any storm swell. The vessel is being taken for safety holding. No explanation, no destination. They turned on the engine. The deck creaked. The motor coughed awake. And just like that, Grace pulled away from the dock without Frank on board. He didn't chase her. He didn't yell. He just stood there, holding the rope that had once tied her to shore. What do you do when the last thing holding you together is taken from you without a word? 3. A grandson's fury, a nation's memory. Frank didn't leave the dock. Long after Grace disappeared into the gray horizon, he remained rooted to the bench that faced the water. His hands rested in his lap, still stained from rope and varnish. Beside him his leather-bound logbook sat unopened, its final page still blank. People passed by. Some paused. Most didn't know what to say. A few teens, unsure what they were witnessing, filmed the moment on their phones. One uploaded it with a vague title, "Old Man Loses Boat." No context, no story, just a man and a missing vessel. But across town, Jacob Mallory, Frank's grandson, was watching something else entirely. He'd just finished cadet training for the day when the video popped up in his feed. For a split second, he thought it was someone else. The image was grainy, the lighting poor, but the stillness, the posture, he knew it. That was his grandfather. That was Grace. And that wasn't right. Jacob moved fast. He made phone calls, one to his academy contact, another to a former instructor who had ties deeper in the naval network. His voice was clipped, angry, restrained. They took Grace. No warning, no protocol, just took her. He didn't ask for revenge. He didn't even ask for action. He just told the truth. Clear, honest, undeniable. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't organized. It wasn't protocol. But the Navy listened, because the name Mallory still meant something. Because somewhere, someone remembered an old engine room, a man with burns who refused medals, and a report quietly filed away under acts of exceptional service. And now that man's boat had been taken without cause. Sometimes it's not the loudest voices that bring change, but the loyal ones, quietly passed from one generation to the next. 4. 6 shadows in the fog. The fog came in fast, too fast for Windmere Cove. It wasn't the kind of morning mist the town was used to. This was thicker, lower, rolling in like something alive. Within minutes, the horizon vanished. The harbor turned ghostly. The air was heavy and sound seemed to move slower. People noticed. Some paused. Others took out their phones, but no one could explain what was happening. Then came the sound. 3 long blasts. Not a ferry horn. Not a fishing boat. This was different, deeper, older. It vibrated through the dock planks, ran up your spine, and settled somewhere behind your ribs. Frank heard it. He looked up, sharp. His posture straightened, his eyes, tired just moments earlier, now focused. He knew that signal. Every Navy man did. Jacob was already standing by his side. The younger man looked out into the thick gray mist, heart thudding. Then a shadow, long, sharp, silent, and then another. They weren't yachts, not fishing trawlers. These were bigger, sleeker, slicing through fog like ghosts through memory. 6 ships, Navy ships, moving slowly, purposefully, one behind the other, their decks empty of celebration, their engines hushed. The only sound was water splitting beneath their weight, and the occasional creak of mooring lines tightening. No announcements, no flags waving high, no crowd to greet them. But the people came anyway. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Dock hands dropped their lines. Tourists stopped mid-sentence. Children went quiet without being told. Why are they here? Someone whispered. No one answered. Frank stood at the dock's edge, still. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just watched as if he'd seen this before. Not in real life, but in a part of his heart that had never forgotten. They came without orders, without ceremony, without sound, but not without purpose. 5. Salute of the Forgotten Hero. The lead ship slowed to a near glide. A small transport boat was lowered into the water. It cut across the harbor like a whispering hurried and wavering, carrying 2 figures dressed in navy white. One held the side rope with quiet precision. The other, older, held a folded American flag tight against his chest. As the boat reached the dock, the officer stepped off first, tying the line to a cleat with muscle memory refined by decades at sea. Then the second man stepped forward. His posture was straight, his gaze focused. His uniform was decorated but understated. No medals jangling, no ribbons flapping, just a simple chest of service and a quiet sense of weight. He walked straight toward Frank. The crowd parted. No one told them to. They just moved instinctively. Frank stood tall. When the admiral reached him, they exchanged salutes, their hands raised with perfect timing, then lowered in unison. The admiral didn't raise a microphone. He didn't call for attention. His voice didn't need volume. It carried with history. In 1983, aboard the USS Lawrence, an engine fire broke out below deck. Chemical containment was minutes from failure. 23 sailors were sleeping in the lower levels, and one-man chief engineer Frank Mallory went in, sealed the leak by hand, and saved the ship. He paused. He refused recognition, declined formal citation. He asked only that we remember the men didn't come back from other missions. He chose silence. There was no applause, just breath held, hearts caught, phones slowly lowered. But silence should never be mistaken for absence, and some names, when whispered, still echo across oceans. A sailor stepped forward, carrying a wooden case. Inside was a plaque. Fixed to it was a brass plate removed from a decommissioned vessel. On it, a simple engraving: for service beyond duty, for courage beyond rank, for the kind of loyalty that doesn't demand to be seen. We remember. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. He ran his hand over the brass slowly, then reached out for the folded flag, pressing it gently to his chest. The admiral stepped back, and with a quiet command, all 6 Navy ships' decks aligned. Hundreds of sailors raised their hands in salute. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the most powerful silence the town had ever heard. Some heroes are never forgotten not because they asked to be remembered, but because they quietly earned it. 6. The sea remembers. The admiral didn't linger. After the salute, he offered Frank one final nod, one that spoke not from rank, but from respect. Then, without pomp or performance, he stepped aside, allowing the moment to breathe. Frank remained at the edge of the dock, the folded flag cradled in his arms, the plaque resting heavy put right in his hands. Around him the town stood in reverent stillness. For many, this was the first time they truly saw Frank not just as the quiet man by the marina, but as something more, a living thread in the fabric of service they'd never known was stitched into their town. Above the harbor, the fog held like a curtain drawn halfway. The sunlight pressed through in soft ribbons, catching the water in golden strokes. The Navy ships didn't move. They anchored in formation, forming a protective arc around the marina like sentries standing guard. Their flags flew at half-mast. Their crews stood firm. No orders barked, no horns sounded, just the quiet hum of engines at idle, and the rhythm of the sea, now calm and sure. Frank didn't cry. He didn't speak, but his back was straight, his hands steady, and his eyes once heavy now held a quiet fire. A few people stepped forward. Some offered words. Others simply placed a hand on his shoulder or offered a silent nod. No one needed to say much. Not anymore. The bench behind him where he had waited for grace just hours earlier was now a place transformed. From loneliness to legacy, from silence to honor. Frank sat once more, carefully placing the flag beside him. His eyes stayed fixed on the water, where Grace had once floated, where she had been taken, and now where the Navy stood, not to reclaim her, but to remember her, to remember him. Because sometimes the sea doesn't shout when it remembers. It simply returns. The sea may forget names, but never loyalty, never service, and never a man like Frank Mallory. 7. The town wakes up. By nightfall, the video had already made its way round the country. It started with a quiet upload, just a few seconds of footage showing 6 Navy ships anchored in the fog, and a solitary man on a dock receiving a folded flag. But in the age of the internet, sometimes quiet things echo the loudest. Comments poured in, from veterans, from strangers, from people who didn't even know where Windmere Cove was, but knew exactly who Frank Mallory had become in their minds. A reminder of sacrifice, of humility, of the kind of courage that never asks for applause. Local news picked it up, then regional, then national. They tried to trace the story backwards, to fill in the blanks, to explain what had happened to Grace and why the Navy came. But the town didn't need the backstory. They had seen it for themselves, and they knew something had changed. The next morning, the marina was different. Not in color, not in structure, but in spirit. People walked slower past the bench where Frank sat. Some stopped. Others brought coffee or warm pastries. They didn't say much, just small gestures that spoke volumes. We saw. We didn't know. We're sorry. The mayor called personally to apologize. The town council held a special session. By noon, they had voted unanimously to place a permanent plaque near Frank's bench, not to glorify, not to dramatize, but to remember. It read, Frank Mallory. He served in silence, and the sea remembered. Meanwhile, something else was quietly unfolding. The Windmere Cove Marina launched a new youth seamanship program. They named it after Frank, but he kindly asked that his name only appear in the paperwork, not on the banners. Let the kids own it, he said. I just want them to learn to tie a proper bowline and treat the sea with respect. And so they did. Frank became the program's first advisor. Not the kind who gives speeches, but the kind who shows up early, checks the knots, and nods quietly when someone gets it right. Not all heroes wear medals. Some wear flannel and carry logbooks. Sometimes the loudest change in a town begins with the quietest man the day everyone finally sees him. 8. Rebuilding Grace. Rebuilding trust. Grace returned 2 days later. She wasn't the same. The hull bore deep scrapes. The cabin door hung crooked. Her brass fittings, once carefully polished, were tarnished and dented. She'd been handled roughly, without the reverence she deserved. The Coast Guard officer who brought her back didn't say much. He handed Frank a clipboard, muttered a few stiff words of apology, and left quickly, boots thudding awkwardly against the dock. Frank didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just ran his hand along her side, his fingers tracing the scars like a father checking a child's wounds. Grace was hurt, but she wasn't gone, and people noticed. A local boat builder stepped forward first. She can be fixed, he said, but if not, we'll build her again. Others followed. A neighboring town offered supplies. A veterans group raised funds. Even kids from the seamanship program volunteered, showing up with paintbrushes and open notebooks. But at the center of it all was Jacob. He pulled out Frank's old notebooks, the ones with sketches, weight calculations, sanding notes, and laid them out on the workshop table. He organized crews, called in favors, built a schedule. He didn't try to replace Grace. He tried to honor her, because Grace wasn't just wood and nails. She was memory in motion. 2 weeks later, her frame stood tall in the builder's shed, not complete, not yet whole, but familiar. The bow curved the same way it had always curved, strong, slightly proud. The stern sloped gently, ready to cut through calm waters again, and the railing just low enough for Frank's elbow to rest where it always had. Frank visited every few days. He didn't rush the process. He didn't supervise with pride. He just stood quietly, offered advice when asked, and watched eyes scanning every line, every joint, like a master craftsman reading his own diary carved into timber. And in that workshop, a second kind of rebuilding was taking place, not just of grace, but of trust, in a town, in a system, in the quiet force of one man's patience. You can't always restore what's been broken, but you can build something new, stronger, with the same heart. 9. A quiet launch, a lasting legacy. There was no parade, no ribbon cutting, no press, just a handful of folding chairs, a breeze off the water, and the kind of silence that feels earned, not awkward. The town had insisted on a ceremony. Frank had insisted it be small, so they compromised. A few words were said, short, simple, full of meaning. A pastor from the local church offered a blessing, not just for the boat, but for everyone who had helped bring her back to life. A few of the kids from the seamanship program stood proudly at attention, their hands brushed clean of sawdust. Then Grace, new in body, but familiar in soul, was rolled gently down the ramp. She kissed the water the way she always had, smooth, calm, confident. A new flag flew at her stern. Her rails gleamed in the sunlight. Her engine purred, low and steady, almost like a heartbeat. Frank stood at the dock. He hesitated for just a second. Then, with the ease of someone stepping through time, he placed one foot on her deck. The weight shifted. The wood creaked in recognition. His hand slid across the rail like it had done 1,000 times before. And in that moment, just for a moment, the pain in his knees faded. The years melted away. Grace was back. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face, usually still and unreadable, softened. His eyes closed, then opened again with quiet resolve. The crowd clapped, but not loudly, because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about presence. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and gold shimmered across the marina, Frank returned to his bench, the same one. The folded flag sat beside him. His gaze stayed on the slip where Grace now rested once more. A young family passed. The child pointed to the new plaque beside the bench and asked, "What does that mean?" The father replied gently, "It means some people give a lot and never ask for anything in return." Frank didn't turn. He just smiled. The best legacies aren't loud. They're steady, like tide and time, man. They always return home. 10. Why this story matters to us all. This isn't just a story about a man, or a boat, or even a town rediscovering its conscience. It's about something we all recognize deep down, the quiet dignity of those who serve without ever asking for thanks. The people who build, who give, who show up day after day, even when no one's watching. Frank Mallory didn't want justice. He didn't want headlines or hashtags. He just wanted grace, because to him, she wasn't just a vessel. She was a memory, a mission, a promise to keep moving forward, even when everything else around you feels still. In the end, it wasn't the Navy ships or the town's plaque that restored what had been lost. It was something simpler, quieter. It was recognition. It was listening. It was a shared realization that duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and that service doesn't always look like sacrifice. It often looks like consistency. Frank reminded us that not all heroes wear medals. Some carry coffee in a thermos. Some build boats with their bare hands. Some sit quietly on a bench by the sea and wait. And when the sea finally speaks, it speaks for them. So if this story moved you, share it, not just with others, but with yourself. Let it remind you to notice the quiet ones, to thank the steady hands, to remember the people who built the world we walk in now. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted. They're the ones whispered. From one tie to the next, he served in silence, and the sea remembered. 11. Memories from the sea. Minnie Hoke. Before Grace was taken, she had already carried stories worth remembering. Long before headlines, long before salutes, Grace had already done her part. There was the storm of '94. The power was out, the roads were blocked, and supplies were running low. Frank didn't wait for permission. He loaded Grace with bottled water, canned food, and blankets, and made run after run to homes cut off by the flood. He never mentioned it. No interviews, no photos, just quiet action. There was the boy Tanner who joined the youth seamanship program one summer, angry and withdrawn after losing his father. Frank taught him how to lash down a line and steer by the wind. 2 years later, Tanner enlisted in the Navy. He wrote Frank a letter from his first ship, thanking him not for the knots, but for the direction. There was the time Grace ferried doctors during a flu outbreak, another when she became a floating classroom after the town school suffered water damage. Frank never hesitated. Grace never failed. These stories weren't documented, but they were remembered by the people who lived them, by the sea that bore witness, and by the boat that never asked, why only, where to? 12 letters. Messages for the internet responds. Mini-hook. Sometimes it takes one video to remind thousands what silent service really looks like. Frank never cared for screens. He never had a social media account. He barely checked his phone. But the rest of the world, it noticed the video of the Navy ships. The folded flag, the man on the bench. It went viral in the quietest, most powerful way. No gimmicks, no filters, just truth. Letters began arriving, some handwritten, some typed, some drawn in crayon by kids who had seen Grace on YouTube with their parents. My grandfather served too. I never really understood him until now. Anna, age 14. I'm a boat builder from Maine. If he ever needs timber, it's on me. Calvin D. You reminded me of the value of quiet men. Thank you, Mr. Mallory, L.T. Commander Ray Navarro wrote. Veterans wrote. Teachers wrote. Strangers wrote. Some apologized for what happened. Some thanked him for what he did. Most just said, simply, we see you now. 13. A legacy that sails forward. Mini-hook. One man built a boat, but what he truly built was a bridge across generations. Months passed. The rebuilt Grace became more than just a symbol. It became a tool once again. The youth seamanship program officially opened under Frank's guidance, not with pomp or cameras, but with instruction, with ropes and buoys, with stories that weren't found in textbooks. On the first day, a new student stood at Grace's helm, a kid who had never even seen the ocean up close before. Frank stood behind him, not commanding, just present. Steady hands, Frank said, and don't fight the water. Listen to it. The boy nodded, small fingers wrapped around the wheel. Grace pulled out from the dock. The wake rippled softly. The boy looked back and smiled. Frank didn't say anything. He just watched, because legacy isn't always about what we leave behind. Sometimes it's about what we put into motion and who takes the helm next.